Thanks again so much for joining us for our March speaker series. We are continuing to speak with and hear more about people's daily journeys and what they work on and how they got to where they got to and any advice they can pass to us along the way. So thank you so much for joining us. This is a joint venture with Women Who Code and LaunchCode, and we'll go ahead and get started with Antoinette Carroll.
All right, sounds good. And I'm just gonna jump in and don't mind the weirdness of my camera. This is what you call a bad user experience design by Dell that decided to put the camera where women's boobs are located versus the very top, just FYI. So I'm just going to talk quickly about myself and my company, and then I'd love for this to be interactive because I'm more of a engagement type person opposed to just having kind of a lecture speaker head. So my name is Antoinette Carroll, and I'm the founder, president, and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab. And we were founded in 2014 in response to the unrest in Ferguson, with myself actually moving out of Ferguson 6 months prior to the unrest on August 9th, or the start of the unrest on August 9th, 2014. I am a St. Louis native, and what's interesting is that my career has kind of had an ebb and flow, which I would argue most people tend to have that type of career. When I started in college, I was studying biology and particularly was looking at biotechnology and studying the human genome. After doing that for a year, I realized it wasn't necessarily for me. It wasn't the fact that I didn't have the grades, because I had a 4.0 and an internship my freshman year at one of the top science firms. It was that I wasn't passionate about it, and it wasn't something in which I was happy doing. And that's something that I've started to focus more and more on every day, is this idea of passion and happiness when doing work, because we spend more time at work than we actually spend at home. And if you're in a space in which you're constantly unhappy, then ultimately that leaks into your personal life. And there is this idea of the reality of our personal selves and our professional selves and having an intersection of both. And so, I went through college testing out a few degrees and ultimately ended with a degree in media studies, emphasis on advertising and integrated marketing, and worked in advertising and marketing for about 7 years, and went through a few different type of positions versus such as working in corporate, working in agency, did nonprofit, and ultimately nonprofit was the space in which I found my calling. Agency wasn't really for me. Corporate, I again didn't have that passion. But in nonprofit, while we are extremely overworked, because I am a workaholic, to me is kind of like I don't want to call it drugs, but it's something that keeps me going. And so I was working at a nonprofit called Diversity Awareness Partnership when the Ferguson arrest happened. I was head of communications. And what I saw was what you typically see, which is a top-down approach to many issues, fragmentation, and spaces around conversation and not as much around actionable response. And so I wanted to create a space for that. And Creative Reaction Lab started as a 24-hour challenge. We had over 60 ideas pitched, 5 were worked on throughout the night, and all 5 were activated in St. Louis within a year. And that really was the start of our organization. Creative Reaction Lab was the name of the event. There was really no 100% plan for it to become its own full-fledged nonprofit until I actually did it. And what was interesting in 2014 was the year in which I gave myself one New Year's resolution, and that was to follow through. It didn't matter what it was, but it was just those simple words, follow through. Because I'm assuming many people have had notebooks of ideas, sketchbooks of ideas, and didn't necessarily follow through on many of them. And then I find them later and say, oh my goodness, what happened? Or why didn't I do that? And so the idea around Creative Reaction Lab was also part of my own personal kind of push for myself to look at how do we create a space where we acknowledge that these issues are of importance, especially when you look at racism or you look at police brutality or social challenges, digital divide, and create a space where we're able to focus on that. And so after working with those teams, and I will tell you, some of those projects are still active to this day, we held 2 more 24-hour labs, one looking at gun violence, another looking at domestic violence. But we decided as an institution that we wanted to actually refine our audience, refine our focus, and be more intentional around the work we were doing. And so we went from looking at human rights inequities to racial inequities, particularly as it related to Black and Latinx populations. We decided that if we're going to really transform many of our communities, our theory of change or idea was to build the racial equity leaders of not only tomorrow or today, but tomorrow. And so we actually primarily work with youth through our programs such as Design to Better Our Community and the Community Design Apprenticeship Program, and particularly Black and Latinx youth, and looking at how do we get them into decision-making roles, but then also when they get into those roles, they make equitable design decisions that impact or positively impact their cultures. And so along this process, we developed a new form of creative problem solving that's received national recognition called Equity-Centered Community Design. And it's a buildup from design thinking. It's a buildup from human-centered design, because I also, as a person that was in advertising marketing, I also did graphic design for a very long time. And so it was looking at how do we transform what I was learning, and I learned in my design classes. I learned at School of Visual Arts in New York in social design, but saying how do we be more intentional around it and acknowledge that just prototyping or ideating or testing is not enough, but we also have to think about the role of our own humility when it comes to actually becoming more empathetic with others, or understanding the role of history and trauma and the role of power when it comes to actually problem solving and addressing many of these social challenges. And so during South by Southwest this year, because we spoke at South by Southwest EDU and at South by Southwest, we revealed our field guide, which is available for free on our website. But it was one of those moments in which many people were very surprised that we put equity and design together, because most of the time you don't hear the conversation, or if you hear it, it's usually around how do we increase diversity within our industry? How do we bring in more people of color? How do we bring in women? Whereas for us, it's looking at it not only internally, but externally. How do we look at the impact that we're making and the role of ourselves as designers as we are transforming society? So whether we're looking at it through the lens of technology and algorithm and biases that are there, or we even look at it through the lens of face-to-face communication and call to actions, how are we perpetuating sometimes some of these larger issues or systems of oppression? And so our work is very socially minded. And, through this journey, one of the things that I've learned is that this idea of failure, it is a privilege to have that. I'm a first generation college student. Neither one of my parents graduated from high school. And when I think about some of the people I grew up with, failure was something that was privileged. It wasn't something that you necessarily were able to do just freely and openly. But when you're able to fail, you are gaining these eternal lessons over time. Like we talk about success a lot and how we all want to be successful. And I would argue with how we even define success. But then what do we need to do to actually get to that moment? And what are those different steps to try to accomplish that? And so, I've been constantly looking at that as a social entrepreneur, as well as a designer, of understanding the privilege I have to fail, but then also what are these lessons that I'm able to build upon to be more intentional and inclusive in the work that I'm doing. And so, what's interesting when I think about my work is that a lot of the things that I've experienced through life is now coming to fruition through this type of work, and it's really integrated into everything I'm doing. The fact that I used to research and now I'm constantly researching every day through the work of Creative Reaction Lab. The fact that I used to experiment in the science area and now I'm experimenting through design, or actually, and honestly, you're always experimenting through design, especially if you do thumbnails. I swear thumbnails are just like mini experiments that always are so painful. But, it's one of those where when we look at where we are or where we can be, everything that we go through is just the journey of our life. And it's these small little nicks or these small moments on that journey that gets us to certain places. And so, it's been great kind of being on this journey and exploring social entrepreneurship and design together. And I'm really kind of looking forward to seeing what becomes of it. And so, I'm interested in really talking to you all and kind of learning or answering any questions that you may have. You can talk about UI, you can talk about UX, you can ask me any question you may have about just being a woman in leadership or being a woman, a female entrepreneur. But I definitely love for this to be more interactive, but I wanted to provide at least that introduction first. All right, Coda girls, we have some questions. Give them to me. Oh, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? I hope you're laughing at this moment because it is painful. It's interesting because imposter syndrome is something that unless you haven't always had power in your life, you really don't think about it, or you're not aware of how deeply rooted it is into your space. And one of the things I started saying to myself a few years ago was that, Antoinette, you have to overcome your poverty of mind and poverty of spirit, especially with me growing up in poverty. I recognize how that impacted many of my decisions. And it's the same when thinking about overcoming this idea of imposter syndrome, because I have many colleagues I talk to that feel like they're imposters in the room. I personally have dealt with that scenario many times, in which I have questioned how the heck I even got here, to be honest. And I wonder if anyone would ever figure me out, or if someone made a mistake and maybe they wanted Antoinette with OI instead of the Antoinette with IO. But then, what's helped me over time was, one, having a network, or sometimes I call them an advisory group of people that, sometimes you need the cheerleaders in your life, but also the people that are very honest with me. And this advisory group of people actually have helped me understand, and they're able to break down many of these moments of achievements that I personally have not been able to see. I am one of those people where I'm such a big picture thinker, and I still have my micro moments, but I very much think about vision, that unless that vision is accomplished, and it usually is very grandiose, I don't even notice the steps. And that sometimes happens when we're in the room, and sometimes whether we're the only woman or the only person of color or the only person with an ability status, or only person from the LGBTQIA community, and you notice that only. And usually, or at least for me, it used to be intimidating. Now I recognize those as opportunities to break that only and bring others in and help them overcome their imposter syndrome by letting them know that it's important for them to be there and that they are deserving. There's many people that are not at the table due to access or due to, assigned power or privilege or whatever it may be, that deserve to be at the table more than others, to be honest. And yet, because of certain kind of hierarchies we've been given in life, we are told to believe that we're imposters. I can tell you now, you're not. If you're in the room, you're meant to be in the room. There's some people, again, that are meant to be in the room that are not there. But if you're in the room, look at the ability, look at the access, look at the power you have. and use it to not only grow yourself personally, but then also to help others grow as well. I will say one of the things that have helped me overcome imposter syndrome, besides the advisory group or just acknowledging the power that I have, was constantly putting myself into those scenarios or situations where I would originally feel like an imposter. And sometimes that's me applying for different programs or showing up to a networking event. And what I noticed over time is I became more comfortable, and I became more comfortable with myself. And that has continually started to show in my work. I remember I remember having a boss that actually said to me that I didn't seem like I was that great of a facilitator. And that led to some of my imposter syndrome moments when I used to facilitate at the beginning. But now I am literally facilitating around the continent. And I'm doing international lecturing opportunities. And so sometimes people may lead to that imposter syndrome, but know the power that you have, know that you are meant to be there for a reason, and continually kind of push yourself to expand where you were or where you continue to be. No problem. Any other questions? What was the hardest part about starting your own venture? There's a few hard parts about starting your venture. One, they never tell you about the full business side. Like, they talk about starting a business, and most of the time when you start a business out of passion or around a certain craft, you don't really think about the administrative side of taxes and payroll and spreadsheets. Apparently spreadsheets is like gold in this space. But the administrative piece is a challenge. And another thing that I had to overcome with this idea of selling my organization or selling myself, I remember in the beginning how uncomfortable I was, feeling like that I just brought up my company 24/7. And so there were, personally, I think, missed business opportunity because of that lack of comfort. But then over time, I realized that I'm constantly repeating the startup story. I'm constantly repeating, what Creative Reaction Lab's doing. And that's because my role is to be one of the faces of the organization. And I say one because I have a team. And some people, when they start their venture, they only focus on themselves. But I like to believe that if you want to be a really good leader, then your job is to create other leaders. And that is not about me, it's about we. And so when thinking about having a venture, it's also about the importance of building the right team and having those days that are up, having those days that are bad, but know that you are doing something to, if nothing else, better your life and hopefully potentially better the community and or the world. I just so happen to be doing all of that because I want to address social issues. Not everyone wants to do that. Some people just wants to create their own firm and just do dope work, and there's nothing wrong with that as well. But the hardest part was that administrative piece, building a team, as well as overcoming kind of my own kind of barriers that I put in my own way to allow me to be successful. Let's see. Any advice you can give women who are unsure if that is the path for them? When you say unsure if that is the path for them, what path? Just so I can give a better answer. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, any advice you can give women who are unsure if the path of starting their own venture is for them? I'm one of those people where I believe in testing at the micro level or at the smallest level possible. Creative Reaction Lab, as stated before, was a 24-hour event. Your pilot could be a 4-hour engagement, or it could be a 2-hour engagement, or, but is this idea of just starting and seeing how comfortable you are with it. There's some people where, as I talk to them, they realize that while they love being in a startup space, they realize that being the founder wasn't necessarily for them. So they still wanted to be in the startup world. They wanted to be at the ground level, building that foundation. But then they realized that, they didn't necessarily have to be the person with the initial idea for that to happen. And so you start to learn that as you test, as you try to figure out, you know, what do I actually feel comfortable with? And it's the same whether you're trying to start your own venture or you're working in different company cultures. As I stated, I worked in an agency, I worked in corporate, I worked in nonprofit, I worked in actual foundations for that are organizations that tend to fund nonprofits. And I realized the different types of culture within these organizations or type of organizations, which made me realize things that I liked more in certain scenarios versus others. And it's the same with starting your own venture. Like I loved nonprofit because you were able to have your hands in so many things. Because I'm a workaholic, I don't like to repeat myself that much. And obviously as a mother, I definitely don't like to repeat myself, but because I don't really like this idea of repetition, being in a corporate setting where you usually have one specific job and you have to do that one job is not something that appeals to me. And when I started my own venture and I told some of my mentors or former supervisor, what was interesting is that every single one of them said, about time. And when they said about time, that was fascinating to me. And they were like, you were always entrepreneurial. You were just one of those people that when you work inside of an organization, you were trying to change it through this lens of, in a sense, entrepreneurship. And so, I would say to start to assess, what do I feel comfortable with? Am I always in an organization that's am I always trying to change things? Am I always trying to build things? Or do I want to deal with the nitty gritty of the administrative side? I am okay with doing the administrative side because to me, it leads towards the greater mission of the organization. I don't care about cutting paychecks. I don't care about writing the grants. I don't care about doing the spreadsheets. I don't care about, honestly, taking out the trash, which I did earlier today. And that's because I realized over time that the path of being entrepreneurial was for me. And, those other opportunities I have were just part of my journey to help me realize it. And so I would test it, and I would test it in the small micro sense, even work at a startup and see what it's like to be on the ground level and see how you feel even in that scenario before you maybe take the leap, because taking a leap is for some people a risk. I know it was a risk for me, especially with me being a breadwinner in my family. When I took the leap to become an entrepreneur, we lost probably around 80 to 85% of our income because I took that risk. And when I say I, that includes we, as in my family. But my family and I understood that because of everything I've been through my journey, the next possible route for me was entrepreneurship. There literally was nothing else. And so, I would kind of look at it, bring in some testing pieces and try to bring in opportunities to be entrepreneurial, even within an organization, and see how you feel with that and how comfortable you are with it. So 2 questions, I'll answer them separately. Do you have any networking advice? Apparently it's important. I personally, I'm gonna be very honest. My first full-time job, I remember very distinctly being at a networking event with, and I was just a coordinator at the time, but it was with some of the donors, some of the performers. It was at this very high-end, part of me wants to say bougie restaurant. And I remember going in the bathroom and going to the bathroom stall and literally crying because of how uncomfortable I was and how much I hated being in that scenario. And part of it could have been due to power, part of it could have been due to the fact that I'd never really been in a scenario like that before. I mean, I was in a community where they were easily spending, the amount of money they were spending on maybe napkins is what my family was paying for rent. Like it was definitely a culture shock in a sense. But now, even though I still am not a huge fan of networking, I understand the power of it. But I also will say, when networking, recognize those moments when you need to be there and recognize those moments when it's okay for you to not be there. There's sometimes, especially whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're trying to, connect with people for a job, or you're just trying to connect in your industry overall. Some people will go to every single networking event, and that's their thing. Like, I actually have a friend that I'm convinced that she gets paid just to go to conferences and networking events. She has so many friends from her networking, and that is her thing, But then I have some colleagues where they won't go to any, and how that has impacted them. I'm one of those people where I will show up when I know I necessarily need to be there. And then I will take those moments where if I need to decompress, I'll decompress and not make it where it's this, either you are here or you're missing something. Like many people talk about FOMO, or fear of missing out. I've come to learn that if you miss something, usually there's an opportunity to gain something in return. Like, there's still opportunities to gain other things. And it's all about what's important of value for you. But I will say, if you are networking in a community, in a certain room, I always tell people to not just think about, oh, you work at X, Y, and Z organization, because unless I'm one of those people that really care about if you work at a big company or not, that tells me nothing whatsoever. I really have no idea. Like, you can say, I work at, now I'm gonna just throw out a name, OXO. Okay, great. Who are you as a person? Like, even when we do workshops, I tell people to introduce themselves by making a pledge on what they want to do to make their community better. I don't want to know about your company. And whether you're a venture founder or you're just an employee, I personally don't care if you worked at Capital One. But I love to hear more about, your fascination with Taco Tuesdays, or I love to hear more about your fascination on, changing, I don't know, public transit infrastructure or whatever it may be. Some people love everything. But what I found is, when you connect with people on more of a, I don't know, candid conversation, relational type piece, those are when the deepest relationships are made. I have had plenty of people connect with me that, they started with their company and I couldn't tell you who they are. But I can tell you the individuals that I actually had a conversation about, either some similarities or maybe some areas in which we disagree, but it was an actual great dialogue. I remember them, because it wasn't about necessarily where they worked, but more about who we are at the human level. And what I found is that when you have those type of conversations, that usually the business piece will come after that. And it's like when you're in a nonprofit space and you talk about donor engagement, they always say, if you don't feel that the donor will say yes, then you haven't actually built a relationship with them. It's not around being transactional, but actually being relational. And it's the same with a networking opportunity. And then the last thing I would say, don't be afraid to bow out of a conversation. I can't tell you how many times you see people just awkwardly stuck. No one will take offense. Usually some people will say, I'd really love to connect with a few other people around the room, or it was such a pleasure talking to you. But when you're stuck, when you can tell someone's stuck and you just see their eyes glazing or they're starting to drift around the room, that relationship is not going to go anywhere anyway. So, don't be afraid to bow out of that as well. And then the other question, what are some methods you use to meet others in the industry and potential donor supporters? I'm going to be honest, and this is what I learned in advertising, and I honestly stand behind this 100%. There's no more effective form of marketing than word of mouth. Period. And word of mouth also includes connections through others. That's why on LinkedIn, when they say you're connected to this person by this person, the reason why they have that is because research has shown that when there's a connection already there, people are more likely to talk to you. I can't tell you how many times I've been connected through a potential funder, or connected to a potential funder that I've maybe talked about in the office, and then someone will say, well, have you talked to the Kauffman Foundation? And I'm like, well, no, because I don't know anyone there. And they're like, oh, I'm going to connect you. And people are willing to connect you more than you think. Again, going back to my previous answer, when you've built a relationship with them. And it's not something where it has to be you've been friends for 28,000 days or anything like that. Like there's some people I built relationship through a 20-minute conversation. They were like, I'm going to connect you with this person because I believe in what you're doing, or I believe in, this piece about you. They feel like they have a connection with you. And it's the same when trying to meet others in the industry and trying to get potential donors and supporters. I can't tell you how many people have come and said, I have donated to you all because I heard you talk at X, Y, and Z. Or I'm going to donate to you because my colleague told me about you all and I went to your website. Like it's that relationship piece should not be undervalued. But I also was saying there's nothing wrong with cold calling people, or as I like to say, cold tweeting. I cold tweet people all the time. And I have no shame about it whatsoever. As far as I'm concerned, if we're in the Twitter sphere, there's like that wall has been broken down. And actually, I've built some really strong relationships just tweeting people and say, I really believe in the work you're doing, and I think it's fantastic. Some of the people I've connected with through Twitter they've come and talked to my students, or they've, actually came to one of my conferences, or they recommended me, and it came from a cold tweet. Like I don't really do cold calls; it's not my thing. But cold tweeting, oh, easily, because most of the time there's someone behind that Twitter account, and I can't tell you how many relationships have come out of cold tweeting people. So I would probably hold on to that just as much as the word of mouth piece and the relationship piece. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. All right, Coder Girls want to know, what resources do you recommend for programmers who want to learn about UX? There's this one is a hashtag on Twitter, as you can tell. I'm clearly a Twitter person, and Instagram, if I'm gonna be honest. There's a hashtag on Twitter called hashtag ethical CX is what I follow a lot, and ethical UX. I think it's both. And they talk a lot around not only being UX designers, but then also how to bring in more, I don't want to even say social justice, but I guess ethical, to not repeat myself, but ethical mindsets into the UX work that you do. And so I will be honest, I'm not a huge book person. I know that's horrible. And I will say my last trip, I read 2 books. Okay. I was very proud of myself. And obviously that plane ride was extremely too long, but I'm more of a video girl. I'm more of a, obviously, social media person. And so even when I think about organizations where I've looked at some of their UX information, it actually, surprisingly, Adobe has been one of those. They have a few blogs in which they not only have done like different blog posts, but they also have different videos in which they've engaged with UX designers. And this past, this summer, I guess, maybe this summer, August, September, they were doing live kind of UX sessions where they brought in some UX designers and they actually were talking through their process. And so I look at things like that, or, Skillshare. I know I didn't go like full detail, but for me, if it's something where it's interactive, where I can do something around it, or if it's something where I can watch people doing it, that's to me more powerful than any book. But I will also recommend, and I know he's a male, but he also used to work at LaunchCode in St. Louis, looking up Timothy Hikes. He's based in St. Louis as well, but he's been doing a lot of kind of national UX work. And I know he was doing work with Adobe around UX engagement as well. So I recommend looking up his efforts as well. Right now he's at Wells Fargo Advisors, I think. Any other questions? Oh.
Does anyone have any additional questions? I guess not. But of course, we can all find Antoinette on Twitter. Go follow her. She's one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter. So definitely go check that out. A big shout out to Antoinette. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone for joining us on the phone and in person. We had a blast. We'll be continuing the series in April with Women Who Code and LaunchCode. Katerina, I don't know if you have anything you would like to add at this time, any events coming up, but.
No, all good on my side.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Antoinette, again for giving us all of your wonderful advice. So we are all going to go log off and start cold tweeting the people we need to cold tweet.
I encourage it. Cold tweet everyone. I mean, not like, I don't know, Michelle Obama or somebody. They might not respond, but I have made some of the greatest connections on Twitter. But thank you all. Feel free to reach out to me. Go to creativereactionlab.com and feel free to download the field guide if you want to look at that more and think about how to integrate equity work into your practice. But keep doing what you're doing. And, I'm happy for you all, and hopefully we'll connect somewhere down the line.
Thanks, Antoinette. Bye-bye.
Bye.